It started with a single flash of light in the New Mexico desert. It was a light so bright that a blind girl riding in a car miles away saw it register on her retinas. It was a light that didn't just illuminate the pre-dawn sky, it set the atmosphere on fire and melted the sand into green glass. Before 5:29 a.m. on July 16, 1945, humans fought wars with steel, fire, and courage. After 5:29 a.m., we fought with the power of the stars. In that fraction of a second, the concept of safety was erased from the surface of the earth. For the next 50 years, humanity would live under a sword of Damocles suspended by a thread that grew thinner every year. As weapons grew from city killers to world enders, the most powerful governments on the planet came to a terrifying realization. The surface was doomed. If they wanted to survive the hell they were creating, they would have to learn to live like insects. They would have to dig. This is the story of the architecture of the apocalypse. This is the story of the silent cities. Chapter 1: The Gadget and the Ghost of Oppenheimer. The journey to the bunkers begins not with concrete, but with physics. To understand why we dug holes in the ground, we must first understand the fire we were hiding from. In the summer of 1945, the Jornada del Muerto, the Journey of the Dead Man, was a stretch of desolate high desert in New Mexico. It was the perfect place to murder the old world. The scientists of the Manhattan Project, led by the enigmatic J. Robert Oppenheimer, had spent years in the secret city of Los Alamos compressing the timeline of scientific discovery. They were racing against the Nazis, driven by the fear that Hitler might get the bomb first. The device they hoisted atop a 100-foot steel tower was nicknamed the Gadget. It was an ugly, bulbous sphere of metal and wires, looking more like a deep-sea diving bell than a weapon of mass destruction. Inside, surrounded by high explosives, was a core of plutonium no larger than an orange. When the countdown hit 0, the conventional explosives fired inward, compressing the plutonium core. The atoms, squeezed beyond endurance, shattered. Matter was converted into energy in accordance with Einstein's famous equation. The resulting explosion defied description. The shock wave knocked men flat 10,000 yards away. The heat was 4 times the temperature of the center of the sun. It vaporized the steel tower. It didn't just blow it up, it turned the steel into gas. Oppenheimer, watching from a bunker, famously recalled a line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." But the military man watching didn't quote scripture. They did math. They calculated the yield at roughly 20 to 22 kilotons, equivalent to 20,000 tons of TNT. It was a weapon of unprecedented power. But in 1945, the military strategists still viewed it as just that, a weapon, a very big bomb to be used against armies or cities to win a war. They did not yet understand that they hadn't just built a bigger bomb, they had changed the fundamental relationship between man and nature. They believed they could control it, they believed they could use it, and 3 weeks later, they did. Chapter 2: The City Killers. The bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 proved that the Gadget was not a fluke. It was a repeatable, deliverable reality. When the little boy uranium bomb detonated over Hiroshima, it didn't hit the ground. It exploded 1,900 feet in the air to maximize the blast radius. The effect was absolute. Within a second, the heart of the city ceased to exist. People were vaporized, leaving only their atomic shadows burned into stone walls, permanent silhouettes of the moment of their death. The blast wave leveled 69% of the city's buildings. The firestorm that followed sucked the oxygen out of the atmosphere, suffocating those who hadn't been crushed or incinerated. Between 90,000 and 146,000 people died, roughly half of them on the first day. Yet, in the immediate aftermath of World War II, the United States did not immediately start digging massive underground cities. Why? Because of the monopoly. From 1945 to 1949, the United States was the only nation on Earth with the atomic bomb. This period was known as the era of atomic diplomacy. American planners believed they held the ultimate trump card. If the Soviet Union, their former ally turned ideological enemy, tried to invade Western Europe with its massive Red Army, the U.S. could simply erase Moscow, Leningrad, and Kiev. The Soviets had no way to hit back in kind. In Washington, the mood was one of cautious supremacy. There was talk of dispersal, moving factories out of crowded cities, but not yet of burying the government. The White House was still safe. The Pentagon was still safe. The Atlantic and Pacific Oceans were still vast moats protecting the American fortress. But in the frozen north of the Soviet Union, enclosed cities that didn't appear on any map, thousands of slave laborers and brilliant physicists were working night and day to break that monopoly. They were led by Lavrenti Beria, the ruthless head of the secret police, who knew that Stalin would execute them if they failed. They had spies inside the Manhattan Project, men like Klaus Fuchs, who fed them the blueprints for the American bomb. The clock was ticking, but Washington couldn't hear it. They thought they had 10 years, maybe 20. They had 4. Chapter 3, Joe 1 and the End of Safety. August 29, 1949. Semipalatinsk, Test Site, Kazakhstan. At 7 a.m., the sky over the Central Asian steppe turned white. The Soviet Union successfully detonated its first atomic device, RDS-1, nicknamed Joe 1 by American intelligence, after Joseph Stalin. It was a near-exact copy of the American Fat Man bomb dropped on Nagasaki. When a U.S. Air Force reconnaissance plane flying over the Pacific detected the radioactive isotopes drifting on the wind a few days later, the data was rushed to Washington. President Harry Truman was shocked. He demanded the scientists check the data again. There was no mistake. The air contained the distinct chemical signature of a plutonium fission explosion. The Russians had the bomb. The psychological impact of Joe 1 cannot be overstated. Overnight, the United States went from being the untouchable god of war to being a potential target. If the Soviets had the bomb, they would soon have the planes to deliver it. The vast oceans were no longer enough. This was the moment the Cold War truly froze. The strategy shifted from compellence, forcing the enemy to do what you want, to deterrence, threatening to kill the enemy if they tried to kill you. It was in this climate of sudden vulnerability that the first conversations about continuity of government, or COG, began in earnest. If Washington, D.C. could be hit, how would the president survive? How would orders be given? The early solutions were crude. They renovated the basement of the White House, the Truman reconstruction. They designated secret relocation sites at universities and country estates outside the city. But these were stopgap measures. They were essentially reinforced basements designed to survive a 20-kiloton blast, a Hiroshima-sized event. But the scientists were already working on something much worse. The atomic bomb, for all its horror, was limited by the laws of physics. There was a limit to how big you could make a fission bomb before it blew itself apart too early. To get a bigger explosion, you needed a different process. You needed to mimic the engine of the sun. You needed hydrogen. You needed the hydrogen bomb. And the hydrogen bomb would change the calculus of survival from hiding in a basement to burying a city. Volume 1, The Physics of Hell. Part 2, The Age of Megatons. Chapter 4, The Super. By 1950, the atomic bomb was already yesterday's nightmare. The race was no longer about splitting atoms, it was about crushing them. In the laboratories of Los Alamos, a Hungarian-born physicist named Edward Teller was obsessed with a theoretical weapon he called the super. His idea was to use a standard atomic bomb not as the weapon itself, but merely as the match to ignite something far more terrifying, a fusion reaction. He wanted to replicate the process that powers the sun. The debate among scientists was fierce. J. Robert Oppenheimer opposed it, arguing that such a weapon had no military utility, it was purely a tool for genocide. But the political pressure was overwhelming. President Truman, terrified that Stalin would get there first, gave the order, "Build it." On November 1, 1952, on the Enuatak Atoll in the Pacific Ocean, the United States tested the world's first thermonuclear device. It was codenamed Ivy Mike. Mike was not a bomb you could drop from a plane. It was a building. It was a massive steel canister, 2 stories tall, filled with liquid deuterium, surrounded by cooling equipment weighing 82 tons. It was a physics experiment, not a weapon of war. When it detonated, the observers didn't just see a flash, they saw the horizon disappear. The fireball expanded to 3 miles in diameter within seconds. It rose into the stratosphere, punching a hole in the atmosphere and turning the sky violet. The mushroom cloud eventually stretched 100 miles wide. When the smoke cleared, the island of Elugalab, where the device had sat, was gone. Not damaged, not burned, gone. In its place was a crater a mile wide and 164 feet deep, filled with seawater. The yield was 10.4 megatons. To understand the scale, you have to do the math. The Hiroshima bomb was roughly 15 kilotons. Ivy Mike was 10,400 kilotons. It was roughly 700 times more powerful than the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. If Hiroshima was a hand grenade, Ivy Mike was a freight train loaded with dynamite. This changed the calculus of survival instantly. A standard atomic bomb might destroy downtown Washington, D.C., leaving the suburbs damaged but alive. A hydrogen bomb of this size dropped on the Capitol would vaporize everything from the Potomac to the Beltway. It would cause third-degree burns 30 miles away in Baltimore. It would set forests on fire in Virginia. The reinforced basements that Truman had renovated were now useless. You couldn't hide in a cellar from a fireball that was hotter than the core of the sun. If the government wanted to survive a megaton-class weapon, they needed to put thousands of feet of solid granite between them and the surface. The era of the mountain bunker had arrived. Chapter 5: Castle Bravo and the Poison Wind. If Ivy Mike proved the blast was survivable only deep underground, the next test proved that the air itself would become the enemy. On March 1, 1954, the U.S. tested its first deliverable hydrogen bomb, codenamed Castle Bravo, at Bikini Atoll. The scientists had calculated the yield would be about 6 megatons. They made a mistake. They underestimated the reactivity of the lithium fuel. When Bravo detonated, it exploded with a force of 15 megatons. It was the most powerful explosion ever created by the United States, 1,000 times stronger than Hiroshima. The blast was terrifying, but the aftermath was worse. The explosion pulverized millions of tons of coral reef, mixing the calcium debris with highly radioactive isotopes from the bomb. This radioactive cloud wasn't just gas, it was dust, heavy, sticky white ash. The wind carried this fallout east. It blanketed the nearby inhabited atolls of Rongelap and Utrecht. Children played in the snow, eating it because it tasted like metal. They would later lose their hair, their skin would burn off, and they would die of leukemia. Worse, the cloud drifted over a Japanese tuna fishing boat called the Daigo Fukuryu Maru, Lucky Dragon No. 5.
The crew had no idea what had happened. They were dusted with the white ash. By the time they returned to port in Japan, they were dying of acute radiation sickness. Castle Bravo taught the world a horrific lesson: fallout. In a nuclear war, the blast is local, but the fallout is global. The poison wind moves with the weather. A bomb dropped on New York could kill people in Boston simply by the wind blowing north. If hundreds of these bombs were detonated, the stratosphere would be choked with strontium-90 and cesium-137. This revelation radically altered bunker design. It wasn't enough to just dig a hole. You had to create a sealed ecosystem. Air filtration. Bunkers now needed massive chemical, biological, and radiological filters. Air from the surface had to be pulled through banks of charcoal and HEPA filters to strip out the radioactive dust before it could be breathed by the president or the Politburo. Overpressure. The inside of the bunker had to be kept at a higher air pressure than the outside. This ensured that if there was a microscopic crack in the concrete, air would blow out, preventing the poison air from sucking in. Decontamination showers. You couldn't just walk into a bunker. You had to pass through airlocks where your clothes would be burned and your skin scrubbed raw to remove the invisible killer. The bunkers were evolving. They were becoming submarines buried in rock.
Chapter 6: The 30-Minute Window. Throughout the 1950s, the delivery system for these apocalyptic weapons was the bomber plane. The U.S. had the B-52 Stratofortress. The Soviets had the Tu-95 Bear. Bombers are slow. It takes hours for a plane to fly from Russia to America over the North Pole. This gave the leadership time. If the radar stations in the Arctic, the DEW line, picked up incoming Soviet bombers, the president had roughly 4 to 6 hours to evacuate. He could be driven comfortably from the White House to a safe location. But on October 4th, 1957, the Soviet Union changed the geometry of time. They launched Sputnik 1. To the American public, Sputnik was a scary metal ball beeping over their heads. To the military planners, it was a death sentence. The rocket that put Sputnik in space was the R-7 Semyorka. It was an intercontinental ballistic missile, an ICBM. If the Soviets could park a satellite in orbit, they could drop a hydrogen bomb on New York City, and the missile traveled at 15,000 miles per hour. The math was brutal and unforgiving. Launch detection, 0 to 2 minutes. Confirmation of track, 2 to 5 minutes. Travel time over the pole, 30 minutes. 30 minutes. That is all the time the President of the United States or the General Secretary of the Soviet Union would have from the moment the alarms blared until the moment their capital city ceased to exist. 30 minutes to wake up. 30 minutes to verify the attack isn't a computer glitch. 30 minutes to decide whether to end the world in retaliation. And 30 minutes to get to safety. You cannot drive a motorcade to a secret mountain retreat in 30 minutes. You cannot evacuate Congress in 30 minutes. This time constraint fundamentally panicked the continuity of government planners. It forced them to adopt 2 desperate strategies. The flying bunker. If you can't get underground fast enough, get in the air. The Looking Glass missions began. Planes that were essentially flying war rooms kept in the air 24 hours a day, every day, for decades. If the ground command centers were vaporized, the general in the sky would take command. The helicopter extraction. The bunkers like Mount Weather in Virginia and Raven Rock in Pennsylvania were too far to drive to, so the White House lawn became a helipad. The plan was terrifyingly tight.
The Marine One helicopter would scoop up the president. They would have to fly through the chaos of a panicking city to reach the mountains before the shockwave hit. The shortened timeline also meant that the bunkers themselves had to be instantly ready. There was no time to stock up. The generators had to be running now. The food had to be on the shelves now. The staff had to be on duty now. The silent cities went from being cold storage facilities to living, breathing organisms, fully staffed and waiting for a war that could start and end in the time it takes to watch a sitcom. By 1960, the stage was set. The weapons were big enough to crack the earth. The fallout was deadly enough to poison the wind, and the missiles were fast enough to kill you before you finished your morning coffee. The surface was indefensible. The only option left was to dig deeper, harder, and faster than ever before.
Volume 2: The American Fortress East. If you were a tourist in the 1960s or 70s, driving through the scenic Blue Ridge Mountains or the Allegheny Highlands, you might have passed an unmarked dirt road blocked by a simple chain-link fence. You might have stayed at a 5-star hotel and admired the strangely thick concrete columns in the exhibition hall. You might have noticed that the television repairmen seemed surprisingly fit and disciplined. You were looking at the end of the world, but you didn't know it. While the public was told to dig holes in their backyards, the federal government was building an underground empire within a helicopter ride of Washington, D.C. This is the story of the Federal Relocation Arc, the secret citadels of Raven Rock, Mount Weather, and the strangest of them all, the bunker beneath the ballroom. Chapter 1: The Resort at the End of the World. White Sulphur Springs, West Virginia is a place of old-world charm. It is home to the Greenbrier, a resort so grand it is often called America's Resort. With its Georgian architecture, perfectly manicured golf courses, and Dorothy Draper-designed interiors full of bold floral prints and rhododendrons, it was the playground of the American aristocracy. Presidents from Eisenhower to Kennedy vacationed here. The Duke and Duchess of Windsor sipped tea in the lobby. It was a place of high society, gossip, and leisure. But in 1958, the guests noticed something odd. The resort announced the construction of a new addition, the West Virginia Wing. It was ostensibly a new wing for guest rooms and a large exhibition center for trade shows, but the construction process was aggressive. Locals watched as endless convoys of dump trucks moved millions of tons of earth. Massive mixers arrived in a steady stream, pouring enough concrete to build a runway at an international airport. The hole they dug wasn't just for a foundation, it was deep enough to bury a cathedral. Strangest of all was the railway traffic. The Greenbrier had its own rail spur, and trains would arrive in the dead of night carrying massive steel beams and strange heavy equipment that looked nothing like hotel furniture. The management dismissed any questions with a smile. It was just a renovation. They were lying. Under the direct orders of President Eisenhower, the U.S. government had approached the owners of the Greenbrier, the CSX Railroad Company, with a top-secret proposal. Washington needed a bunker. Not for the president, he had other places, but for the legislative branch. The logic was grim but practical. If Washington was vaporized, American democracy would cease to exist unless Congress survived. They needed a place to house the 100 members of the Senate and the 435 members of the House of Representatives, along with their aides. They needed a place far enough from D.C. to escape the immediate blast radius, but close enough to reach by train or car in 4 hours. They codenamed it Project Greek Island. For the next 30 years, beneath the feet of golfing CEOs and debutantes, the United States Congress had a secret bedroom waiting for the apocalypse. Chapter 2: Behind the Wallpaper. The entrance to the end of the world was hidden behind a folding partition in the West Virginia Wing's exhibition hall. To the casual observer, it looked like a wall covered in a garish floral-patterned wallpaper designed to blend in with the hotel's decor. But if you knew where to look, you could peel back the wallpaper to reveal a seam, and behind that seam was a blast door. This wasn't a normal door. It was a monolith of steel and concrete, 18 inches thick, weighing 25 tons. It was engineered to withstand a nuclear blast occurring 15 to 30 miles away. Despite its immense weight, the hinges were so perfectly balanced that a single person could push it shut. Once closed, the seal was airtight. The resort above could be reduced to radioactive ash, but the air inside would remain breathable. Crossing that threshold was like stepping from a palace into a prison. The bunker was a 2-level concrete city buried 720 feet into the hillside. It was 112,544 square feet, the size of 2 football fields. The dormitories, the living quarters, were a study in democratic misery. There were 18 dormitories designed to house over 1,100 people. There were no private suites. The senators and representatives would sleep in metal bunk beds stacked too high in crowded communal rooms. The mattresses were thin, the lockers were narrow. In the apocalypse, the Speaker of the House got the same accommodations as a junior staffer. It was designed for survival, not comfort. The chambers. To maintain the continuity of government, the bunker contained 2 auditoriums. One seated 435 people, the House, the other 100, the Senate. They were equipped with microphones, rostrums, and recording equipment. In the events of war, these cold concrete rooms would become the Capitol building of the United States. Laws would be passed here. Declarations of war would be ratified here. The hospital. Perhaps the most chilling section was the medical clinic. It wasn't a first aid station, it was a fully functional hospital. It had an operating theater, an intensive care unit, and a pharmacy stocked with enough antidepressants to sedate the entire Congress. The planners knew that the psychological toll of the apocalypse would be as deadly as the radiation. There was also a pathological waste incinerator. It was designed to burn medical waste, but its size and capacity suggested a darker purpose. In a sealed bunker, you cannot bury the dead. If a congressman died of a heart attack or radiation sickness, he would be cremated in the incinerator, his ashes stored until the radiation outside subsided enough to scatter them. The cafeteria. The kitchen was stocked with enough freeze-dried food to feed the entire population for 45 days. The menus were cyclic and depressing, mostly rehydrated stews and biscuits. But the kitchen equipment was top-of-the-line commercial grade. The logic was that a well-fed government was a stable government. The communication center. This was the heart of the facility, a room filled with teletype machines, phone banks, and radio transmitters. It was connected to the outside world by miles of buried copper cable and microwave towers disguised as part of the hotel's infrastructure. From this room, the surviving government could talk to the military bunkers, the missile silos, and whatever remained of the American public. Chapter 3. The Shadow Crew and the Exposure. Building the bunker was one thing. Keeping it secret for 30 years was a miracle of spycraft. How do you maintain a nuclear facility inside a busy hotel without anyone noticing? You create a fake company. The government created a shell corporation called Forsyth Associates. Ostensibly, they were a company hired by the hotel to maintain the hundreds of television sets in the guest rooms. A team of men worked for Forsyth Associates at the Greenbrier. They wore uniforms, carried tool belts, and were seen walking around the hotel fixing TVs. But they were not TV repairmen. They were top-secret government contractors with high-level security clearances. Their job wasn't to fix the color balance on a guest's TV, though they did that too to maintain cover. Their real job was to slip behind the wallpaper door and maintain the air filtration systems, check the diesel generators, rotate the food stocks, and ensure the 25-ton doors didn't rust shut. For 3 decades, these men lived a double life. They were friendly repairmen by day and guardians of the apocalypse by night. They kept the bunker in a state of constant 24-hour readiness. The beds were always made, the water tanks were always full, the phone lines were always humming. The secret held through the Cuban Missile Crisis, through the assassination of JFK, through the Vietnam War, and through the height of the Reagan-era tensions. But secrets, like concrete, eventually crack. In 1992, the Cold War was over. The Soviet Union had collapsed. The imminent threat of global thermonuclear war had receded. In this relaxed atmosphere, whispers began to reach the press. Ted Gupp, an investigative reporter for the Washington Post, began asking questions. He found former employees who were willing to talk. He found anomalies in the hotel's construction records. He pieced together the puzzle. On Sunday, May 31st, 1992, the Washington Post ran the story on its front page, "The Ultimate Congressional Hideaway." The reaction was immediate. The secret was out. The bunker's location was now public knowledge, which meant it was useless. In a nuclear war, a secret bunker is a safe haven. A known bunker is a target. The very next day, the Pentagon began the process of decommissioning the site. The lease with the hotel was terminated. The fuel was pumped out of the generators. The freeze-dried food was removed. The blast doors were unsealed. Today, you can take a tour of the Greenbrier bunker. You can walk through the decontamination showers. You can sit in the auditorium where laws were meant to be passed while the world burned. It is a museum now, a time capsule of a future that never happened. But as you walk through those cold corridors, you realize something unsettling. This was just one bunker. This was just for Congress. Where was the president going? Where was the Supreme Court? Where were the generals? They weren't going to a hotel in West Virginia. They were going somewhere much harder, much deeper, and much more terrifying. They were going to the mountains of stone. Volume 2, The American Fortress, East. Part 2, The War Castles. Chapter 4, The Underground Pentagon, Site Far. If the Greenbrier was a lifeboat for democracy, Raven Rock was a battleship buried in stone. Located just 6 miles north of Camp David, straddling the Pennsylvania-Maryland border, Raven Rock Mountain looks like any other peak in the Appalachians. It is covered in dense forest, quiet and unassuming, but if you were to hike near it, you would notice the ventilation shafts hidden among the trees, the massive microwave towers piercing the canopy, and the fences marked with signs warning of lethal force. This is Site R. It is the alternate Pentagon. Construction began in 1951, driven by the terrifying realization that the above-ground Pentagon in Virginia, a massive, soft target, would be one of the first buildings vaporized in a Soviet first strike. The Joint Chiefs of Staff needed a place where they could not just survive, but command a global nuclear war. They chose Raven Rock because of its geology. The mountain is made of greenstone, a type of granite so hard it ruins drill bits. The Army Corps of Engineers spent 3 years blasting out a cavern large enough to hold a small city. What they built inside defies imagination. Raven Rock is not just a series of tunnels, it is a freestanding city. Inside the hollowed-out cavern, engineers constructed 5 separate 3-story buildings. These buildings do not touch the walls or the ceiling of the cave. Instead, they sit on massive steel springs and shock absorbers. The engineering logic is brutal. If a multi-megaton hydrogen bomb were to strike the mountain directly, the granite would transmit a shock wave that would liquefy a normal human being. But inside Site R, the buildings would bounce.
The lights might flicker, coffee might spill, but the generals inside would remain conscious, and the computers would keep running. Site R has everything needed to fight World War III. The reservoir, a massive underground lake holding millions of gallons of water, enough to cool the supercomputers and keep the inhabitants alive for months. The power plant, 6 massive diesel generators capable of powering a mid-sized American city. The subway, a network of tunnels and electric carts to move personnel and equipment between the cavern buildings. But unlike the Greenbrier, which felt like a hotel, Raven Rock feels like a submarine. The air is recycled and smells of ozone and machine oil. There is no natural light. The walls are painted industrial green and gray. It is a place of pure function. During the Cold War, a shadow staff worked here 24/7. They mirrored the work done at the real Pentagon. If the connection to Washington was lost, signaling that the capital was gone, Site R would instantaneously become the supreme military command post of the United States. From these buried rooms, the orders would go out to the silos in the Dakotas and the submarines in the North Atlantic. Launch. Chapter 5. Mount Weather, the Shadow Government. While Raven Rock was built for the warriors, Mount Weather was built for the rulers. Officially known as the High Point Special Facility, it is located in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia, about 48 miles from Washington. For decades, its existence was one of the most closely guarded secrets of the Cold War. Even members of Congress were often unaware of its true purpose. Mount Weather is the designated ARC for the executive branch. Under the Continuity of Operations Plan, or COOP, the survival of the presidency is paramount. In a crisis, the president himself would likely be rushed to the Flying Pentagon, the E-4B Night Watch aircraft, or Air Force One. But a government is more than just one man. It is a bureaucracy. It is the cabinet secretaries, the Supreme Court justices, the heads of essential agencies like the FBI, the CIA, and the Treasury. Mount Weather was built to house this shadow government. Like Raven Rock, it is a city within a mountain, completed in 1959. But Mount Weather is designed not just for war, but for governance. It operates as a sovereign city-state underground. The law, it has its own police force and fire department. The society, it has a hospital, a cafeteria, dormitories, and even a crematorium. The data, perhaps most chillingly, Mount Weather houses a massive mainframe computer system. During the Cold War, this system, known as the Survivors Database, allegedly held the vital records of millions of Americans, along with lists of subversives to be detained in the event of martial law. The facility created a terrifying social experiment, the selected few. There was a list, a literal list of names kept in the White House and at key agencies. If the warning siren sounded, giving that 30-minute window, helicopters would be dispatched to specific landing zones in D.C. to pick up the people on the list. The protocol was ruthless. The selected officials were issued special ID cards. They were told that in the event of an activation, they were to report to the evacuation point immediately. They were explicitly told they could not bring their spouses or children. Imagine the psychology of that moment. A siren wails. A cabinet secretary knows he has 20 minutes before the firestorm. He has a seat on a helicopter bound for the safety of Mount Weather. But to take it, he must look at his wife and children, knowing they will be left behind to burn. He must choose between his duty to the state and his duty to his family. Drills were conducted regularly. Men would leave their dinners, kiss their families goodbye, and disappear into the night, flown to the mountain to practice running a dead country.
Chapter 6. The Watchful Eye. What distinguishes Raven Rock and Mount Weather from the Greenbrier is that they are not museums. They are alive. When the Cold War ended in 1991, the Greenbrier was exposed and decommissioned. But the war castles remained active. In fact, after the attacks of September 11, 2001, they were fully activated. Vice President Dick Cheney and key members of the Bush administration spent weeks inside Raven Rock and Mount Weather, running the government from the underground. Today, if you drive past the gates of Mount Weather on Route 601, you will see modern, high-tech security barriers. The fences are electrified. The guards carry automatic weapons. The microwave towers have been replaced by fiber optic cables, but the lights are still on. The threat has changed, from Soviet ICBMs to cyber terrorism, biological weapons, or rogue nuclear states, but the infrastructure remains. The government still keeps the engines running, the air filters clean, and the beds made. They are still waiting. Volume 3: The Red Giant. In Washington, the bunkers were built to save the Constitution. In Moscow, they were built to save the party. While the Americans hid their arcs under golf courses and inside remote granite peaks, the Soviet Union did something bolder. They built their secret world right beneath the feet of their citizens. For decades, millions of Muscovites rode the subway to work, admiring the marble arches and chandeliers of the world's most beautiful metro system, completely unaware that just a few meters below their train wheels, a second secret train was running. A ghost train carrying the men who controlled their lives. This is the story of the Red Giant, a subterranean empire of steel tunnels, hollowed-out mountains in the Urals, and a city that doesn't exist on any map. Chapter 1: The Paranoia of Steel. To understand the Soviet underground, you have to understand the mind of Joseph Stalin. During World War II, as the Nazi war machine rolled toward Moscow, Stalin refused to leave the city. He stayed in a bunker. That experience, the feeling of the earth shaking from German bombs while he sat safe behind meters of concrete, imprinted itself on the Soviet psyche. Safety meant depth. When the atomic age dawned, Stalin ordered his engineers to dig, but they didn't just dig holes, they dug labyrinths. The most famous of these early efforts is Bunker 42, Tagansky Protected Command Point. Located in the heart of Moscow, hidden beneath a nondescript 19th century building in a quiet alley, it sits 65 meters, 213 feet underground. Construction began in 1951. It was an engineering nightmare. The builders had to excavate thousands of tons of earth and rock in the middle of a bustling city without anyone noticing. They used the construction of the public Taganskaya metro station as cover. Workers and materials moved through the public shafts, diverting into secret tunnels that didn't appear on the blueprints. Bunker 42 was a masterpiece of claustrophobic survival. It was a series of 4 parallel tunnels connected by corridors, totaling 75,000 square feet. It was sheathed in cast iron plates and waterproofed with lead to stop radiation. It had its own air recycling system, generating oxygen from chemical cartridges similar to those used in submarines. This wasn't a place for comfort. It was the long-range aviation command post. In the event of a nuclear war, this is where the order to launch Soviet bombers would come from. For 30 years, communications officers sat in the damp chill, listening to the static of the radio, waiting for the code that would end the world. But Bunker 42 was just a command post. It was small. The Soviet leadership needed something that could move them. They needed a getaway car buried in the earth. Chapter 2: Metro 2: The Ghost Train. If you ask a Moscow tour guide about Metro 2, they might smile and call it an urban legend. If you ask a former KGB officer, they will likely change the subject. But Metro 2, codenamed D6 by the KGB, is very real. It is a shadow subway system built parallel to and deeper than the public Moscow metro. It was started under Stalin and expanded by every premier after him. It has no ticket booths. It has no schedules. Its stations are stark concrete platforms hidden behind heavy steel blast doors that look like maintenance access panels in the public tunnels. The system was designed for one purpose: swift, secret evacuation. In a crisis, the elite would not be stuck in traffic on the streets of Moscow. They would disappear into secret entrances inside the Kremlin, the Lubyanka, KGB headquarters, and the Ministry of Defense. They would board short, specialized trains, sometimes just a single battery-operated car, and be whisked away at high speed. The D6 line connects the seats of power in the city center to the safety of the suburbs and beyond. It runs south, deep under the Moscow River, linking the Kremlin to the government airport at Vnukovo 2 for escape by air, and more importantly, to the ultimate destination, Ramenki 43. For decades, urban explorers in Russia have risked prison to find the entrances. They have brought back blurry photos of rusted gates, strange tunnels with no third rail, and tracks that vanish into the darkness. It is a transportation system for ghosts, a silent artery pulsing beneath the heartbeat of the capital. Chapter 3. The Underground City, Ramenki 43. If Metro 2 is the road, Ramenki 43 is the destination. In the southwest of Moscow, beneath a large empty lot and a few nondescript industrial buildings near Moscow State University, lies what American intelligence agencies believe is the largest underground bunker in the world. Ramenki 43 isn't just a bunker, it is a subterranean city. Built between the mid-1960s and mid-1970s, it is estimated to be roughly 500 acres in size. Reports from defectors and CIA analysis suggest a multi-level complex built to house 15,000 to 30,000 people for up to 30 years. The scale is staggering. Unlike the American bunkers, which were designed to hold the government for a few months until the radiation settled, the Soviet philosophy was different. They were prepared for the long haul. The depth. It is buried deep, rumored to be between 180 and 300 meters underground, far deeper than any American facility. At that depth, it is virtually invulnerable to even a direct hit by a modern thermonuclear warhead. The life support. It reportedly contains its own independent power grid, possibly nuclear. It has deep wells tapping into ancient aquifers. It has vast warehouses of food, medicine, and fuel. The society. Intelligence reports describe cinemas, swimming pools, and living quarters separated by rank. It was designed to preserve not just the lives of the leaders, but their lifestyle and their culture. Ramenki 43 was the ultimate expression of Soviet Cold War strategy. It was a concrete statement that they were willing to outlast the West. While Washington planned to bounce on springs in Wave and Rock, Moscow planned to simply wait it out in the crushing depths of the earth. But even Ramenki was just a holding area. The true Doomsday fortress was not in Moscow. It was thousands of miles away, deep in the Ural Mountains, in a place that makes Raven Rock look like a toy. Chapter 4. The Mountain of Judgment, Mount Yamantau. In the 1990s, just after the Cold War supposedly ended, American spy satellites noticed something disturbing. In the remote Ural Mountains, at a peak called Mount Yamantau, which translates from the local Bashkir language as Evil Mountain or Mount Wicked, there was massive construction activity. The Soviet Union had collapsed. The Russian economy was in ruins. People were standing in bread lines in Moscow, and yet billions of rubles were being poured into this remote mountain. Tens of thousands of workers were digging. New railroads were being built. Highways were being paved into the wilderness. The U.S. government asked Russia, "What are you building?" The Russian response was vague. "It is a mining site. It is a repository for Russian treasures. It is a food storage facility." They were lying. Yamantau is believed to be the modern successor to the Cold War bunkers, a facility so massive it defies comprehension. It is estimated to be a complex of 400 square miles buried inside the quartz mountain. Unlike the older bunkers, Yamantau is still being built and maintained today. It is a closed city, patrolled by the military and special forces. It represents the continuation of the Cold War mindset into the 21st century. It is the ultimate ark,
a place where the Russian Federation intends to survive the next apocalypse, whether it comes from NATO missiles, a biological plague, or an asteroid impact. The red giant didn't stop digging when the wall fell, it just dug deeper.
Volume 4: The Iron Curtain's Shadow. The Hook. If Washington and Moscow were the generals, Europe was the infantry. Everyone knew that if the Cold War turned hot, the first battles and the first nuclear strikes would not happen in Texas or Siberia. They would happen in Germany. Living in the shadow of the Iron Curtain meant living with the knowledge that you were standing on ground zero. While the superpowers built arcs for their leaders to survive a global exchange, the leaders of Europe built bunkers for a different reason. They needed to survive the first 15 minutes. This is the story of the frantic digging in the buffer zone. From the forests of East Germany to the rolling hills of the English countryside, and finally to the paranoid madness of a tiny Balkan nation that tried to bunker every single family. Chapter 1: The Front Line, Honecker's Tomb. East Germany, the GDR, was the Soviet Union's westernmost outpost. It was the tip of the spear. The communist leadership in East Berlin knew a terrifying secret. In the event of a NATO invasion or a nuclear exchange, Soviet war plans treated East Germany not as a country to be defended, but as a zone of scorched earth. Erich Honecker, the leader of East Germany, needed a hole to hide in. Deep in the pine forests north of Berlin, near the village of Pundin, lies the Bunker Complex 5000. Built between 1978 and 1983, it was the most sophisticated bunker in the Warsaw Pact outside of the Soviet Union. To build it, the Stasi, secret police, erased the forest from the map. They closed roads, relocated locals, and poured 85,000 tons of concrete into the sandy soil. The bunker, codenamed Pearl, was a 3-story structure suspended inside a massive concrete shell. Like the American bunkers, the rooms hung on nitrogen-compressed shock absorbers to survive the earth-shattering tremors of a nuclear hit. Inside, it was a sterile, beige world of German efficiency. It had decontamination showers, a command center with direct lines to Moscow, and quarters for 400 of the GDR's top elite. But unlike the Soviet bunkers designed for decades of survival, Honecker's bunker was grimly realistic. The air filtration and power systems were designed to last only 14 days. That was the calculation. The East German leadership believed that within 2 weeks of World War III starting, the surface would either be safe enough to leave, or everyone would be dead, and there would be no point in coming out. It was a tomb with a 2-week timer. Today, the bunker is sealed. In 2008, the German government, tired of paying for its maintenance and fearing neo-Nazis or vandals would use it, poured concrete into the entrances and sealed the vents. Erich Honecker's Ark is now a time capsule buried forever beneath the forest floor, dark and silent. Chapter 2: The City Under the Stone, Burlington. Across the Channel, the British were digging with equal desperation, but with a very different style. In the picturesque Cotswolds, beneath the rolling green fields and stone walls of Wiltshire, lies a secret that the British government kept for 50 years. It was codenamed Burlington, also known as Stockwell, Sutterfuge, and Turnstile. It is not just a bunker, it is a subterranean city spread over 240 acres. Originally an old stone quarry, the British government converted it in the 1950s into the emergency seat of government. It was designed to house 4,000 people, the Prime Minister, Harold Macmillan at the time, the Cabinet, the Royals, and a legion of civil servants. Burlington was uniquely British.
It had an underground pub, the Rose and Crown. It had a BBC radio studio so the Prime Minister could address the nation, or what was left of it. It had a telephone exchange that was for a time the second largest in Britain. It even had an underground lake for fresh water and a bakery. The plan was for the Prime Minister to govern the UK from this stone city for up to 3 months. They used electric buggies to get around the miles of tunnels. The street names were quintessentially English: First Avenue, Westminster Way. But by the 1960s, a terrifying realization hit the British planners. The hydrogen bombs were getting too big. The heat from the modern Soviet detonation wouldn't just shake the ground, it would heat the rock above the bunker to thousands of degrees. The people inside wouldn't be crushed, they would be baked alive in a stone oven. Burlington was quietly downgraded but kept on standby until the end of the Cold War. It was finally declassified in 2004. When the doors were opened, they found teacups still sitting on desks and rotary phones waiting to ring. It remains a ghostly, silent version of 1950s London, frozen in stone.
Chapter 3: The Land of Mushrooms. Albania's Madness. While the Germans and British built bunkers for the elite, one man decided to build bunkers for everyone. Enver Hoxha was the communist dictator of Albania, a tiny Balkan Mucian. Hoxha was a man consumed by a paranoia so vast it consumed his entire country. He broke ties with the West. Then he broke ties with the Soviet Union, calling them too soft. And finally, he broke ties with China. He believed the entire world was coming to destroy Albania. His solution was bunkerizimi, bunkerization. Starting in the late 1960s, Hoxha ordered the construction of concrete bunkers across the entire country. Not dozens, not hundreds, 750,000 bunkers. For a country of only 3 million people, that was one bunker for every 4 citizens. They sprouted like concrete mushrooms everywhere. You can find them on the pristine beaches of the Adriatic, in farmers' fields, in city playgrounds, and perched on steep mountain cliffs. There were 3 types: the QZ, small 1- or 2-man pillboxes. Thousands of these lined the borders and roads. They were cramped, damp, and terrifyingly claustrophobic. The PZ, command bunkers for officers. Command complexes, massive underground tunnels for Hoxha and the party elite, like the one built into the side of a mountain outside Tirana, now a museum called Bunk Art. The cost was catastrophic. The concrete and steel used to build these useless domes could have solved Albania's housing shortage twice over. The program bankrupted the nation. Engineers who designed the bunkers were allegedly put inside them while tanks fired shells at the prototypes to test their strength, a terrifying incentive to build them well. Hoxha died in 1985. The invasion never came. No one wanted to conquer Albania. Today, the bunkers remain. They are too heavy to move and too thick to destroy. Young Albanians use them for parties. Farmers use them to store grain or house livestock. Some have been painted like ladybugs. Others have been turned into cafes. They sit on the landscape like the scars of a national mental illness, a concrete testament to how fear can drive a leader and a country completely insane. Volume 5: The Human Experiment. Building a city underground requires engineering. Living in it requires madness. While the architects calculated the thickness of blast doors and the capacity of water tanks, the doctors and psychologists were asking a darker question. What happens to the human animal when you trap it in a concrete box for a year? We are not mole rats. We crave the sun. We need open space. We rely on the cycle of day and night to keep our sanity.
Take those away, add the crushing fear of nuclear annihilation, and cram 1,000 strangers into a dormitory smelling of recycled air and chemical toilets, and you have a recipe not for survival, but for a breakdown. This is the story of the secret experiments conducted by the superpowers to see if humanity could endure its own salvation. Chapter 1. The 100-Person Tomb. The 1962 Navy Test. In the summer of 1962, just months before the Cuban Missile Crisis would bring the world to the brink, the U.S. Navy conducted a chilling experiment. They wanted to know if ordinary civilians could actually survive in a standard fallout shelter. They built a prototype shelter at the National Naval Medical Center in Bethesda, Maryland. It was a concrete rectangle, 25 by 48 feet. Into this space, they packed 100 volunteers, Navy recruits and their families, men, women, and children. The doors were sealed. For 2 weeks, they were cut off from the world. The first thing they noticed was not the fear, but the heat. 100 human bodies in a confined space generate an immense amount of thermal energy. The ventilation system, designed to filter out radiation, struggled to move the air. The temperature inside climbed to over 90 degrees Fahrenheit. The humidity hit 95%. Then came the smell. The chemical toilets were separated from the living area only by a thin canvas curtain. Within days, the stench of human waste, unwashed bodies, and vomit from heat sickness became overpowering. But the most terrifying result was the social breakdown. Psychologists observing through hidden cameras noticed a phenomenon they called the cocooning. People stopped socializing. They withdrew into themselves. They lay on their bunks for hours, staring at the concrete ceiling, unresponsive. Apathy set in. Arguments broke out over trivial things: a snoring neighbor, a crying baby, a hoarding of crackers. The thin veneer of civilization began to crack under the pressure of sweat and claustrophobia. And this was just a test. There were no bombs falling. They knew they could leave. If the world outside had actually been burning, the psychologists predicted that apathy would have turned into violence. The report concluded that while the shelter could keep people alive biologically, psychological survival was far from guaranteed. Chapter 2. BIOS 3 and the Martian Nightmare. Across the ocean, the Soviets were running a much more ambitious and disturbing experiment. In Siberia, at the Institute of Biophysics in Krasnoyarsk, they built BIOS 3. This wasn't just a bunker, it was a sealed ecosystem. It was designed to test if humans could survive indefinitely underground or in space by recycling everything. Inside this steel hermetic chamber, 3 crew members were sealed in for up to 6 months at a time. They brought no food, they had to grow it. They had vats of algae, chlorella, that turned carbon dioxide back into oxygen. They had wheat fields growing under artificial purple lights. They drank water recycled from their own urine and humidity. They baked bread from the wheat they grew. They were self-sufficient. But the psychological toll was severe. The crew members began to detach from reality. They developed a hatred for the mission control monitoring them from outside. They became paranoid. In one instance, a crew member reportedly experienced a hallucination that the facility was filling with invisible gas. The Soviets discovered that without the natural rhythm of the sun, the human circadian rhythm desynchronizes. The crew would stay awake for 30 hours and sleep for 10. Time lost its meaning. They were drifting in a timeless steel void. The most chilling finding from BIOS 3 was the micro-society problem. In a small, sealed group, if 2 people bonded, the third became an outcast. The outcast would become the target of hostility, a scapegoat for all the misery of the confinement. In a bunker of 100 people, this dynamic could lead to a tribal war.
Chapter 3. the lifeboat ethics. The most difficult part of the human experiment wasn't biological, it was moral. The planners of the Cold War had to write the rule book for the end of the world. They called it lifeboat ethics. In every government bunker, from Mount Weather to the Greenbrier, there were strict protocols for triage. If the bunker was sealed and the air filtration system failed in Sector 4, what do? You don't try to fix it, you seal off Sector 4. You let the people inside suffocate to save the rest of the bunker. If the food supplies ran low, who ate? The scientists? The soldiers? The politicians? The protocols were clear. Value was determined by utility. A doctor was worth more than a lawyer. A young woman of childbearing age was worth more than a grandmother. The bunker was a machine for the survival of the species, and it had no room for sentimentality. There were even protocols for sedation and disposal. If a resident of the bunker had a mental breakdown, screaming, panicking, threatening the order, they were not to be counseled. They were to be sedated immediately. If they could not be calmed, they were a liability. In the harsh calculus of the underground, a liability is a threat to the organism. The human experiment revealed a dark truth. We could build walls thick enough to stop a nuclear blast. We could build filters to scrub the poison from the air, but we could not engineer a way to stop the terror from eating us from the inside out. The silent cities were designed to save humanity, but to survive in them, we might have had to sacrifice our humanity. Volume 6: The Doomsday Machinery. We imagine the end of the world as a decision made by a man. We picture a president or a premier sitting in a bunker, agonizing over a moral choice, his finger hovering over a red button. But that is a comforting lie. By the 1980s, the logic of nuclear war had become too fast for the human brain. 30 minutes was not enough time for a moral debate. So the superpowers did something unthinkable. They built machines to fight the war for them. They wired the apocalypse into computer chips, seismic sensors, and automated lockets. The most terrifying bunker in the world wasn't built to house a president. It was built to house a computer program designed to murder the planet, even after every human in Russia was dead. This is the story of the Doomsday Machinery. Chapter 1: The Football and the Biscuit. Before we get to the machines, we must understand the trigger. In the United States, the mechanism of destruction is portable. It is a black leather briefcase known as the nuclear football. It is carried by a military aide who stands within a few feet of the president at all times, whether he is in the White House, on a golf course, or visiting a foreign country. Inside the briefcase, there is no big red button. There is a book of decision options, cartoons for the apocalypse, and a verification card nicknamed the Biscuit. The Biscuit contains the gold codes. The system relies on communication. The president opens the case, picks an attack option, major attack option 1, 2, etc., and reads the codes to the Pentagon's war room in the basement or the alternate National Military Command Center in Raven Rock. But this system had a flaw. What if a Soviet decapitation strike hit Washington before the president could open the briefcase? What if the electromagnetic pulse, or EMP, from a nuclear blast fried all the phone lines? If the order couldn't be sent, the silos in North Dakota would sit silent. The submarines would circle aimlessly. America would die without firing a shot. The strategists called this the decapitation problem. The Americans solved it with redundancy, putting generals in airplanes, looking glass, that could take over. But the Soviets, terrified of American technology, came up with a much darker solution. Chapter 2: The Dead Hand, Perimeter. Deep inside a hardened bunker south of Moscow, likely near Mount Yamantau, sits a system known to the Russians as Perimeter. The West calls it the Dead Hand.
It is the ultimate doomsday machine. Activated in the early 1980s, Perimeter was designed to ensure that the Soviet Union could strike back, even if its entire leadership was wiped out in a surprise attack. It is a semi-automated system of vengeance. Here is how it works. In a time of crisis, a high-ranking official switches the system to combat mode. From that moment on, the machine starts listening. It uses a network of sensors across Russia to listen for specific signs: seismic activity, the distinct ground tremors of nuclear explosions, radiation, spikes in radioactivity in the atmosphere, and air pressure, the crushing overpressure of blast waves. If the machine detects these signs, it tries to call the Kremlin. It checks for a pulse from the general staff. If there's no answer, if the lines are dead, implying the leadership has been vaporized, Perimeter takes the final step. It does not need a human to turn a key. It does not need a code. The computer launches a special command rocket. This rocket flies across the Soviet Union, broadcasting a radio signal down to all the surviving nuclear silos, submarines, and mobile launchers. The signal overrides the manual locks. It opens the silo doors. It launches the nukes. It is a system designed to murder the United States automatically, triggered by the death throes of the Soviet Union. The most terrifying part, intelligence experts believe Perimeter is still active today. It is still listening. Chapter 3: The Mountain with Eyes, Cheyenne Mountain. While the Soviets built a machine to launch missiles, the Americans built a machine to see them coming. In Colorado Springs, the Cheyenne Mountain Complex, NORAD, is perhaps the most famous bunker in the world. It is the Eyes of the West. Hollowed out of solid granite, the entrance is protected by two 25-ton blast doors spaced apart so that one remains closed while the other opens, an airlock for a fortress. Inside, 15 buildings sit on 1,319 giant steel springs. The job of the men and women inside Cheyenne Mountain was to watch the radar screens connected to the BMEWS, Ballistic Missile Early Warning System. They were looking for the heat signature of a Soviet rocket engine igniting. The stress in this bunker was psychological. They dealt with the Phantom War. On November 9, 1979, the computers at Cheyenne Mountain lit up. The screen showed a massive Soviet nuclear attack. 250 missiles inbound, then 2,200. The sirens screamed, the blast doors slammed shut. The Air Force scrambled interceptor jets. The president's national security advisor was woken up and told, "We are under attack." He was preparing to call the president to release the codes. The world was minutes away from ending. Then, the Phantom missiles vanished. It turned out that a technician had accidentally loaded a training tape, a simulation of World War III, into the main combat computer. The computer thought the simulation was real. 3 years later, in 1983, a Soviet satellite warning system, OKO, reported 5 American missiles launching. The officer in charge, Stanislav Petrov, sat in a bunker near Moscow. The protocol said, "Tell the Kremlin." If he had, the dead hand might have been activated, but Petrov trusted his gut. He decided it was a glitch. He did nothing. He was right. It was the sun reflecting off clouds. The bunkers were built to protect us, but the technology inside them almost killed us. The Doomsday machinery was efficient, fast, and blind. We had built a gun, pointed it at our own heads, and handed the trigger to a microchip. Volume 7: The Underground Great Wall. In America, the bunkers were for the government. In Russia, they were for the party. But in China and Switzerland, the philosophy was radically different. They didn't just want to save the leaders, they tried to save everyone. In Beijing, millions of citizens dug a second city beneath their streets,
by hand. In Switzerland, the law mandated that every single man, woman, and child have a reinforced concrete bed waiting for them beneath the Alps. This is the story of the underground Great Wall and the Swiss hedgehog, two nations that turned their entire geography into a fortress. Chapter 1. Dig Deep, Store Grain, Dixia Cheng. In 1969, the world watched the standoff between the U.S. and the USSR, but Mao Zedong, the leader of Communist China, was looking at a different threat. Relations with his former ally, the Soviet Union, had collapsed. Skirmishes were breaking out along the border. Mao became convinced that a Soviet nuclear attack was imminent. His command to the people of Beijing was simple and terrifying. Shen Wadong Chengliang, dig deep, store grain. And so Beijing began to dig. Unlike the high-tech machine-bored tunnels of Raven Rock, Dixia Cheng, the underground city, was built largely by hand. Hundreds of thousands of ordinary citizens, school children, factory workers, soldiers, spent their evenings and weekends digging. They removed centuries of earth using shovels and bamboo baskets. They dismantled the ancient city walls of Beijing to use the stones for hardening the tunnels. The result was a labyrinth that remains one of the engineering wonders of the 20th century. Dixia Cheng is a web of tunnels covering an area of 33 square miles or 85 square kilometers. It lies about 30 to 60 feet underground. It was designed to house 6 million people, almost the entire population of Beijing at the time. This wasn't just a shelter, it was a functioning society. The tunnels connected the Forbidden City, Tiananmen Square, and the major military bases. Inside, there were classrooms for children, hospitals, dining halls, granaries, and even a roller skating rink and a movie theater. The ventilation system was designed to protect against chemical and biological weapons. The tunnels were engineered with brutal practicality. If a section was bombed, blast doors would seal it off, sacrificing those inside to save the rest of the network. There were rumored escape routes that ran all the way to the western hills outside the city, allowing the population to flee after the mushroom clouds had settled. The war with the Soviets never happened. The underground city was never used for its intended purpose, but it didn't stay empty. In the decades that followed, the dank tunnels were repurposed. Some became cheap hotels and hostels, housing the rat tribe, migrant workers who couldn't afford housing on the surface. Others became wine cellars or mushroom farms. Today, most entrances are sealed or hidden behind shop counters in the back alleys of Beijing, a dark, dusty monument to Mao's paranoia. Chapter 2. The Swiss Hedgehog. If China's approach was desperate, Switzerland's was methodical. Switzerland is famous for its neutrality, but the Swiss concept of neutrality is not pacifism, it is armed neutrality. Their philosophy is simple. Make the country so difficult, so painful, and so expensive to conquer that no one will bother trying. In the Cold War, Switzerland turned itself into a porcupine, or more accurately, a tortoise with a concrete shell. In 1963, the Swiss government passed a federal law. Every inhabitant must have a protected place in a shelter capable of withstanding modern weapons of war. It was the only country in the world to attempt this, and they succeeded. Building codes required every new house and apartment block to have a nuclear shelter with a reinforced steel door and an air filtration system. If you didn't build one, you had to pay a tax to secure a spot in a public shelter. By the end of the Cold War, Switzerland had enough bunker space for 114% of its population. They could save everyone, plus the tourists. But the domestic shelters were just the beginning. The Swiss army hollowed out the Alps. They built secret air bases inside mountains where fighter jets would take off from tunnels and land back inside the rock.
they built artillery fortresses disguised as chalets and barns. If you drove through the Swiss countryside in the 1980s, that picturesque wooden stable on the hillside might actually have been a concrete bunker housing a 105-millimeter cannon pointed at the road. They rigged their own infrastructure to self-destruct. Every major bridge, tunnel, and mountain pass was pre-wired with explosives, removed only recently. In the event of an invasion by Soviet tanks, Switzerland would simply blow up all the roads and retreat into the mountains, sealing the doors behind them.
Chapter 3: The Failure of the Giants, the Sonnenberg Tunnel. The obsession with safety culminated in a project of hubris that rivaled the Tower of Babel, the Sonnenberg Tunnel. Located in Lucerne, this was a dual-purpose structure. In peacetime, it was a busy highway tunnel for cars, but in wartime, it was designed to transform into the world's largest civilian nuclear shelter. The plan was staggering. Within 24 hours of a warning, traffic would be stopped. Massive curved blast doors weighing 350 tons each would swing shut to seal the tunnel portals. Inside, the tunnel would be subdivided into 3 decks. It was designed to house 20,000 people. It had a command center, a prison, a radio studio, and a hospital with an operating theater. It was a masterpiece of Swiss engineering. But in 1987, during a major drill called Operation Ant, the reality crashed down. It took 24 hours just to close one of the 4 main blast doors. The logistics of moving 20,000 terrified civilians into a tunnel, setting up thousands of bunk beds, and managing sewage and food were a nightmare. The psychological experts concluded that cramming that many people into a confined space would lead to mass hysteria and chaos within days. The Sonnenberg Tunnel proved that there is a limit to how much you can scale up survival. You can build a door big enough to stop a nuke, but you cannot build a society that can survive behind it. Today, the Sonnenberg is just a highway tunnel again, though the massive blast doors are still there, hidden in the walls, rusting quietly as cars speed by. Volume 8: The Mind in the Box. The engineers solved the problem of air pressure. The architects solved the problem of blastways. The agronomists solved the problem of food storage. But there was one variable they could never quite solve, one structural weakness that threatened to bring the whole system crashing down from the inside. You can lock a human being in a concrete box, give them recycled water and vitamin paste, and keep them biologically alive for years. But you cannot make them sane. Deep underground, stripped of sunlight, separated from their families, and burdened with the knowledge that the world above is a radioactive cinder, the human mind begins to fray. This is the story of the psychological war fought in the dark, the battle against boredom, claustrophobia, and the crushing weight of survivor's guilt. Chapter 1: 2 Men and a Key, the Missileers. The front line of the psychological war wasn't in a massive city bunker. It was in a tiny steel capsule buried 60 feet beneath the wheat fields of North Dakota and Wyoming. These were the Launch Control Centers, LCCs. Inside each one sat 2 men, usually young Air Force officers known as missileers. Their job was simple and terrifying. They sat in front of a console for 24-hour shifts. Around their necks they wore keys. If the order came, a stream of alphanumeric characters over the radio, they had to decode it, insert their keys, and turn them simultaneously. In doing so, they would launch 10 Minuteman missiles, likely killing millions of people halfway across the world. The psychological pressure was immense. The Air Force created the Personnel Reliability Program, PRP, to monitor them constantly. Before every shift, they briefed each other on their mental state. I had a fight with my wife. I have a headache. Any sign of instability meant you were pulled from duty. But the real enemy was boredom mixed with terror. They were trapped in a room the size of a shipping container, smelling of stale coffee and ozone. They drilled the launch sequence hundreds of times. They lived with the constant gnawing question, would I actually do it? Psychologists worried about the two-man rule. The rule stated that no single person could launch a nuke. It required two keys turned at once. But what if one man cracked? What if one man refused to turn the key when the order came? Or worse, what if one man tried to launch without an order? The bunkers were designed with this paranoia in mind. The two officers carried sidearms. They were implicitly guarding each other. If your partner went rogue, your orders were to shoot him. Chapter 2. The Death of Time. The Cave Experiments. In a massive bunker like Mount Weather, meant to house thousands, the problem wasn't just trust, it was time. Without the sun, the human body loses its anchor. To understand this, scientists looked to a French geologist named Michel Siffre. In 1962, Siffre lowered himself into a subterranean glacier in the French Alps. He stayed there for 2 months in total darkness, with no clock, no calendar, and no contact with the surface. He simply called his team when he woke up and when he went to sleep. The results were terrifying for bunker planners. Siffre's mind drifted. His days stretched out. He would stay awake for 30 hours and sleep for 12, thinking it was a normal 24-hour cycle. When he finally emerged on September 14th, he argued violently with his team, convinced it was only August 20th. He had lost an entire month. His memory began to fail. His coordination suffered. He became depressed. This free-running circadian rhythm meant that in a sealed bunker, society would desynchronize. The guards, the cooks, and the politicians would all be operating on different internal clocks. Chaos would ensue. To combat this, the silent cities were designed with rigid artificial environments. The lights. In bunkers like the Greenbrier, the lights were never just on. They were bright white in the morning, softer yellow in the evening, and dim red at night, forcing the body to adhere to a 24-hour schedule. The routine, life underground, was strictly regimented. Breakfast at 700, work at 800, exercise at 1700. Boredom was the enemy, routine was the cure. Chapter 3. The Survivor's Guilt. But the darkest psychological hurdle was one that no amount of lighting or scheduling could fix. It was the guilt. Imagine being a mid-level bureaucrat selected for the Mount Weather Arc. The siren sounds. You rush to the helicopter. You look down as you lift off, seeing the gridlock of traffic, the panic in the streets, the faces of people, perhaps even your own neighbors who are about to die. You survive. You land in the mountain. The blast doors seal. You feel the tremor of the bombs destroying Washington, D.C. Now you have to go to a meeting about tax policy or agricultural reconstruction. Psychologists predicted that shelter shock would incapacitate a significant percentage of the survivors. Depression, catatonia, and suicide would be rampant. There were rumors, never officially confirmed, but persistent among staff, that the bunkers were stocked with L pills, lethal pills, or heavy sedatives, not for the enemy, but for the residents who couldn't handle the reality of the post-apocalyptic world. In the Soviet Union, the approach was more brutal. There was less emphasis on counseling and more on command. Loyalty to the party was the psychological glue. But even there, the strain of knowing that the motherland was burning above them was expected to break even the hardest men. The bunkers were engineering triumphs, but they were built for biological machines, not emotional beings. The planners realized that the people who walked out of the bunkers 5 years after the war might be alive, but they would not be the same people who walked in. They would be the ghosts of a dead world, ruling over a kingdom of ash. Volume 9. The Day After and the New Aristocracy. For 40 years, the world held its breath. We built the cities, we stocked the shelves, and we drilled the procedures. But the siren never sounded. The key was never turned. But what if it had? Historical documents declassified in recent years allow us to reconstruct, minute by terrifying minute, exactly what life would have looked like inside the silent cities during the first 24 hours of World War III. It is a scenario of organized chaos, where the mundane bureaucracy of government meets the absolute horror of extinction. And while the government bunkers sit rusting today, a new kind of silent city is being built. The Cold War is over, but the fear is not. A new class of bunkers is rising, not for politicians, but for the ultra-wealthy. The privatization of the apocalypse has begun. Chapter 1. The Scenario. The first 24 hours. Let us imagine the date is November 2nd, 1983. Tensions are high during the NATO Able Archer exercise. A radar glitch in the Soviet Union is interpreted as a real attack. The order is given. T-minus 30 minutes. The gold phone rings in the White House. The president is moved. At Mount Weather, the klaxons blare, a sound described by staff as a scream that vibrates in your teeth. The massive blast doors, weighing 25 tons, begin their slow hydraulic slide shut. T-minus 15 minutes. The helicopters arrive. The selected few, cabinet members, essential judges, top bureaucrats, scramble onto the tarmac. They are carrying only small go bags. Behind them, in the distance, they can see the traffic jams forming on I-66 as the public realizes something is wrong. They look back, knowing they will never see their homes again. Hour 0. The doors seal. The air pressure inside the bunker spikes as the overpressure system kicks in to keep radiation out. The first tremors are felt through the floor springs, not the direct hit, but the shock waves of Washington, D.C. ceasing to exist 48 miles away. The lights flicker, then stabilize as the diesel generators roar to life. Hour 1. The fog of war sets in. The communication center is chaotic. Screens go white. Sensors on the surface go dead. The leadership is blind. They are trying to command a nation that is rapidly disintegrating. The president, if he reached the flying command post, or his successor at Mount Weather, issues the retaliatory order. The world ends while they drink lukewarm coffee from styrofoam cups. Hour 12. The adrenaline fades. The reality sets in. The residents are assigned to their bunks. The hierarchy of the outside world reestablishes itself in the concrete. The Speaker of the House argues with a general about food rationing. A secretary weeps in the bathroom. The air smells of ozone and recycled sweat. Hour 24. The silence. The bombing has stopped. The surface is quiet, save for the crackle of fires. Inside, the post-attack protocols begin. They are no longer governing a country, they are managing a lifeboat. The realization hits them. They are the lucky ones, yet they are also prisoners. They are alive, but they are the rulers of a graveyard. Chapter 2. The Long Silence. The original government plans estimated a stay of 14 to 30 days. Later, as weapon yields increased, this was extended to 6 months or even years. The most chilling aspect of the post-attack plan was the reconstruction. The bunkers contained vast databases, the seeds of the IRS, the Social Security Administration, and the Federal Reserve. The plan was, once the radiation subsided, the government would emerge, find the ragged survivors, and immediately restart the tax system. They would reissue currency. They would enforce martial law. There were plans to draft survivors into labor battalions to clear rubble and bury the dead. There were plans to seize all surviving food stocks. The government in the bunker viewed the population on the surface not as victims to be helped, but as a resource to be managed or a mob to be controlled. The disconnect was total. Inside, they ate freeze-dried beef stroganoff and watched movies in the cinema. Outside, the survivors fought over cans of dog food in the ruins. The silent cities were designed to preserve the idea of the state, even at the expense of the people. Chapter 3. The New Aristocracy. Luxury Survival. The Cold War ended. The government bunkers were exposed and decommissioned. But the fear did not die. It just changed hands. In the 21st century, a new phenomenon has emerged: the luxury bunker. Silicon Valley billionaires, hedge fund managers, and nervous tech moguls began to buy up decommissioned missile silos in Kansas and Nebraska. They didn't want the Spartan military bunks of the 1960s. They wanted the apocalypse, but with high thread count cheats. The survival condo. In Kansas, a developer bought an old Atlas F missile silo. He spent millions converting the deep, hardened concrete tube into a luxury apartment complex. It goes 15 stories underground. The apartments cost $1.5 million to $4.5 million each. They have digital windows, high-definition screens that simulate a view of a forest or a beach, tricking the brain into thinking it's above ground. The facility has a swimming pool, a rock climbing wall, a movie theater, a dog park, and a hydroponic farm where they grow fresh arugula. It has a tactical team and an armory. The New Zealand escape. Other elites looked further afield. Peter Thiel, the co-founder of PayPal, and other tech giants bought vast tracts of land in New Zealand. They view the remote island nation as the ultimate bolt hole. They have built panic rooms and reinforced the bunkers beneath their estates, accessible by private jet. This is the new face of the silent city. It is no longer a government project funded by tax dollars for the continuity of the state. It is a private enterprise funded by personal wealth for the continuity of the individual. The philosophy remains the same. The world might end, but I will survive. The difference is that in 1960, the ticket to the bunker was earned by your rank in the government. In 2025, the ticket is bought with a wire transfer. The Cold War bunkers were monuments to national paranoia. The modern bunkers are monuments to extreme inequality. They ask a disturbing question: if the future is for sale, who gets to see it? Volume 10: Resurrection and Ruin. Empires fall, ideologies fade, but concrete lasts forever. When the Berlin Wall crumbled in 1989 and the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991, the great engine of the Cold War finally ran out of steam. The threat of immediate annihilation vanished overnight. The trillions of dollars spent on the underground cities suddenly seemed like a waste. The guards went home, the lights were turned off, the pumps stopped running. Today, these titans lie scattered across the northern hemisphere like the bones of a prehistoric beast. Some have been swallowed by the forest, some have been turned into theme parks, and some are still waiting, silent and active, for a war that has changed its face. This is the final chapter, the story of what happens to a doomsday machine when doomsday is canceled. Chapter 1: The Decay and the Explorers. In the chaos of the post-Soviet 1990s, the great bunkers of the Eastern Bloc were orphans. There was no money to maintain them and no money to dismantle them, so they were simply abandoned. Nature, patient and relentless, began to reclaim them. In the forests of East Germany and the mountains of Ukraine, water began to seep through the microscopic cracks in the concrete. Without the constant hum of the dehumidifiers, mold loomed on the walls. Rust ate through the blast doors. The subterranean lakes, meant for drinking water, rose and flooded the lower levels, turning command centers into dark underwater reefs. Then came the scavengers. In Russia, desperate men stripped the copper wiring, the aluminum fixtures, and even the heavy steel doors to sell for scrap metal. They gutted the silent cities, leaving them as hollow shells. But in the last decade, a new kind of visitor has arrived, the urban explorer, or urbex. Armed with cameras, flashlights, and Geiger counters, these modern adventurers sneak past the rusted "Do Not Enter" signs. They descend into the darkness to document the decay. They bring back haunting images that look like scenes from a post-apocalyptic film. A control room in Latvia where a portrait of Lenin still hangs, peeling and faded, overlooking dead monitors. A cafeteria in Poland where dust-covered plates sit on tables as if the diners just left. A missile silo in Ukraine flooded with black water, reflecting the open sky above like a dark eye. These explorers are the archaeologists of the near future. They remind us that these places were real. They capture the overwhelming silence of a place built for noise and war. Chapter 2: The Museums of Paranoia. Not all bunkers were abandoned to the rot. Some were discovered by a force even more powerful than nature: capitalism. In the West, and increasingly in the East, the Cold War has become a tourist attraction. The fear of the past has been packaged and sold as entertainment. The Greenbrier, USA. Once the most secret site in America, the Congressional Bunker is now a must-see stop on the resort's tour. You can pay $40 to walk through the blast door. You can buy a t-shirt in the gift shop. You can eat dinner in the cafeteria where Congress was meant to eat survival rations. The terror has been sanitized. It is a museum of what if. Bunker 42, Russia. In Moscow, the Tagansky command post has been turned into a subterranean theme park. You can take a lift down 65 meters, walk the steel-lined tunnels, and play nuclear launch simulation games. You can book a wedding there. The specter of nuclear annihilation is now a backdrop for parties. The Kelvedon Hatch, UK. In Britain, a secret government bunker is now a tourist site marked by a simple brown road sign, Secret Nuclear Bunker. The irony is heavy. This commodification serves a purpose. It allows us to process the trauma of the Cold War safely. By turning these monsters into museums, we strip them of their power. We laugh at the outdated computers and the primitive bunks, reassuring ourselves that we are smarter, safer, and past all that madness. But are we? Chapter 3: The Eternal Watch. The most chilling realization comes when you look at the bunkers that are not museums. Mount Weather in Virginia is not open to the public. The fences are new. The cameras are digital. The guards are very real. Raven Rock in Pennsylvania is still the alternate Pentagon. After 9/11, it saw a surge in funding and modernization. Yamantau Mountain in Russia is still a closed city, forbidden to outsiders, with construction reportedly continuing deep within the rock. The silent cities didn't die, they evolved. The threat is no longer just a single exchange of ICBMs. It is cyber warfare that could take down the power grid. It is a bioengineered pandemic. It is an asteroid strike. It is climate collapse. The governments of the world still believe that the only way to ensure survival is to have a hole to hide in. The technology has changed: servers instead of teletypes, hydroponics instead of freeze-dried stew, but the instinct is the same. The ark is still there, waiting for the rain. Conclusion: the monument to fear. As we look back at the 100,000-word journey we have taken, from the blinding flash of the first bomb to the rusting hulks of the Soviet silos, what is the lesson? The silent cities are the pyramids of our age. Like the pyramids, they were built by empires at the height of their power. Like the pyramids, they were built to cheat death and secure immortality for the rulers. And like the pyramids, they were ultimately futile. They stand as monuments to a failure of imagination. They represent a time when the smartest, most powerful people on Earth decided that it was easier to dig graves for the living than to figure out how to live together on the surface. They are a warning carved in concrete. They remind us that civilization is fragile. They remind us that the machinery of our own destruction is real, it is heavy, and it is waiting. The bunkers are silent now. But in the silence, if you listen closely, you can hear the echo of the question they pose to us. Next time the clock strikes midnight, will we be ready to stop the hand? Or will we just run for the door?